I never believed the stories about the hermit in the Maine woods. People in the area talked about him like he was some kind of ghost, a shadow you might see out of the corner of your eye before it melted into the pines. Supposedly, he had been living out there for decades, stealing food and propane from summer cabins, but never letting anyone get close enough to see his face. Most folks claimed it was nothing more than a local legend to scare kids away from wandering too far. But the first night I stayed alone in my uncle's lakeside cabin, I started to wonder if maybe there was some truth to it. The air that night was heavy with mist, the kind that clings to your clothes and makes every sound carry just a little farther than it should. The forest outside felt alive not with animals, but with something watching. I'd arrived earlier that afternoon to open the place for the season. My uncle had given me a long list of chores: clear the leaves off the deck, get the propane tanks hooked up, check the canoe for leaks. By nightfall, I was tired enough to drop onto the couch and drift off without even locking the door. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the creak of settling wood or the rustle of wind in the trees. It was softer, more deliberate, like fabric brushing against wood. My eyes adjusted to the dim orange glow from the dying fireplace, and that's when I noticed the front door was ajar, the dark wedge of the forest pressing in. My first thought was that I must have forgotten to latch it, but then I saw the wet footprints on the floor, leading past the couch and into the kitchen. They were bare feet long, pale, and spaced out in a way that suggested someone was moving carefully, almost silently. I called out, my voice breaking in the quiet, and the sound seemed to be swallowed by the cabin's small rooms. There was no answer, but the faint metallic scrape of the propane stove knob being turned made my stomach knot. I grabbed the flashlight from the side table and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the dark toward the kitchen doorway. The light fell on a man thin, with an unkempt beard and clothes that looked like they had been worn for months without washing. His eyes caught the light like an animal's, reflecting it back in a strange, glassy way. He didn't move at first, just stood there with one hand resting on the counter, as if he had been caught halfway between action and stillness. Then, slowly, he raised his finger to his lips in a shushing gesture, and that was when I noticed the small backpack on the floor beside him, already half full with my food, matches, and a coil of rope from the shed. I tried to speak, to ask him what he wanted, but the words wouldn't come out right. Something about him wasn't just wrong. It was wrong in a way that felt older than me, older than the cabin, older than the stories themselves. He moved toward the open door without a sound, slipping into the night with a speed that made me doubt I'd actually seen him leave. I followed, stepping barefoot into the damp grass, the cold instantly biting into my skin. The beam of the flashlight swept across the trees, catching glimpses of movement, just a flicker of a shoulder disappearing behind a trunk, the edge of a worn coat slipping into shadow. I pushed farther into the woods, the smell of wet earth growing stronger, until I found myself in a small clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, inside of which sat a small tin pot, still warm to the touch. Around it were items I recognized from my uncle's cabin, mixed with things that clearly didn't belong to me. Old radios with broken dials, plastic bags stuffed with folded clothes, and a scattering of small glass bottles filled with cloudy liquid. The ground was trampled in a way that suggested years of use, but the strangest part was how silent it was. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I realized there were eyes in the dark, dozens of them, reflecting back at me from every angle. I thought they were animals at first, but then they blinked in perfect unison, and I knew they belonged to people. Or at least they used to. The beam caught a glimpse of faces pale, dirt-streaked, hair matted, expressions blank as if whatever they were looking at wasn't me, but through me. None of them moved closer, but I could feel the pressure of their attention, an unspoken message that I had stepped somewhere I shouldn't be. My instincts screamed at me to run, but when I turned back toward the way I came, the path was gone, swallowed up by the trees. The hermit was there now, standing just beyond the reach of the light, his head tilted in a way that made me think of a bird sizing up prey. He didn't speak, just pointed toward the ground, and when I looked down, I saw a bare footprint long and pale pressing into the soil, right beside mine, though no one was standing there. I ran then, crashing through the undergrowth until the sight of the cabin's dim light broke through the branches. I slammed the door shut, locked it this time, and sat with my back against it until the first light of morning. When my uncle returned later that day, I told him everything, expecting him to laugh it off as an overactive imagination. Instead, his face went pale, and he told me never to follow anything I saw in those woods again, no matter how human it looked. He said the man I'd seen wasn't just the hermit, that the hermit had been out there for so long the forest had claimed him, and now he wasn't entirely himself anymore. I left that same afternoon, and I've never gone back. But sometimes, when I'm camping miles away from that place, I'll wake up to the sound of fabric brushing against wood, or find a bare, pale footprint in the dirt outside my tent. And I know he's still out there, moving silently between the trees, watching, waiting for someone to follow him back to the place where the forest keeps its own. I had heard the locals talk about the Hermit of Hendy Woods ever since I first visited Northern California in the late 70s. At first, I thought it was just another backwoods tale told to entertain tourists, the kind of legend meant to give a sleepy state park a bit of mystery. They said his name was Petro Zelenko, a Russian immigrant who had been living in the park for nearly 2 decades, long before anyone thought to put up signs warning campers to store their food in bear-safe lockers. He had no family, no permanent home, and no official claim to the land. Yet he remained in those redwoods year after year, building primitive shelters from fallen branches and scavenged tin, living off what the forest provided and what he could discreetly take from the edges of civilization. To some, he was a harmless curiosity, an eccentric who preferred the company of ancient trees to people. To others, especially children who heard his story around campfires, he was something closer to a ghost, a shadow figure you might glimpse from the corner of your eye, always watching, but never close enough to touch. I didn't believe much of it until the summer I took a job at the park. My duties were simple: clear debris from trails, check campsites for compliance, and make sure visitors followed park rules. I spent most days in the open, but every so often, my rounds took me deep into the old growth, where the redwoods grew so thick the light turned to dusk even in the middle of the day. That's where people said Petro's shelters were hidden, tucked in hollows and gullies where no casual hiker would stumble upon them. One afternoon, while marking down the condition of an unmaintained path, I found something strange, a narrow trail I didn't recognize, leading away from the main route. It wasn't marked on any map, and the earth was packed in a way that suggested it had been walked often, but only by 1 or 2 people. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I realized the usual forest noises, the distant rush of wind, the chatter of birds, the hum of insects, had faded away entirely. My boots sank into soft, damp earth, and the air felt thick with the scent of decaying leaves. Eventually, I came to a small clearing where I saw it, a shelter made from overlapping slabs of bark and old sheet metal, hatched together in a way that looked more like instinct than construction. Smoke curled from a small hole in the roof, and hanging from the nearby branches were odd collections of objects: rusted tin cups, cracked compasses, pieces of rope knotted in strange patterns. Before I could decide whether to approach, a figure stepped out from the shadows. He was smaller than I expected, stooped with age, his long coat hanging in tatters, his beard streaked with gray and filled with bits of moss, as if the forest itself had claimed him. His eyes were dark, sharp, and unreadable. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither moving. Then he spoke in a voice that was deep but quiet, his accent thick, asking me if I had gotten lost. I explained I was a park worker and had wandered off my route. He smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. He told me the park was big, bigger than most people realized, and that there were places in it where the trees remembered things people had long forgotten. He invited me to sit by his fire, and though every instinct told me to leave, I found myself stepping into the clearing. His shelter was even stranger up close inside. The walls were lined with scavenged pages from old books, each one pinned carefully in place. Some were covered in writing I couldn't read, symbols that didn't look like any alphabet I knew. He offered me tea from a dented kettle, and I took it only to be polite. The steam smelled faintly of pine and something metallic. He talked about the redwoods as if they were alive in a way beyond biology, speaking of them like they were old friends who whispered secrets to those who stayed long enough to listen. He said the forest gave him everything he needed: and in return he kept the balance by staying hidden from the modern world. When I asked him what he meant by keeping the balance, he didn't answer right away. He just stared into the fire, the flickering light making the shadows behind him seem to move. Then he said that sometimes the forest asked for things he couldn't refuse. My skin prickled at the way he said it, not in the tone of a metaphor, but like it was a debt he was bound to pay. Before I could press him further, he leaned in close and told me I should leave before the light faded completely. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that left no room for argument. I thanked him and turned to go, but when I glanced back over my shoulder, he was gone. The fire was still burning, but the shelter looked abandoned, the objects hanging from the trees swaying gently as if disturbed by a passing wind I couldn't feel. I made it back to the main trail just as the last light was draining from the sky. When I returned the next day with another ranger, the path I'd taken before was nowhere to be found. We searched for hours, but the clearing and the shelter had vanished as if they'd never existed. The other ranger told me that wasn't unusual. People swore they'd seen Petro years after his death in 1981, claiming he appeared exactly as he had in life, right down to the tattered coat and moss-filled beard. Some thought it was just local lore, but others believed the forest had taken him in completely, making him part of it in a way no one could explain. I still work in parks today, but I've never gone that far into Hendy Woods again. Sometimes, though, when I'm in another forest and the world goes unnaturally quiet, I think about that day. I think about the look in Petro's eyes, the way the path seemed to vanish behind me, and the strange weight of the air as he spoke about the forest, asking for things. And I wonder if maybe he's still out there, not as a man anymore, but as something else entirely, waiting in the deep places where the trees remember. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get truly lost in the wilderness, the kind of lost where every tree looks the same, and the air feels heavy with a silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. But that's exactly what happened in July of 2025, when I took my 9-year-old son Sterling on what was supposed to be a short summer adventure into California's Stanislaus National Forest. It started out harmless enough, a drive along scenic roads with the GPS set to guide us to a picnic area I'd read about online. The directions were clear at first, winding us through patches of sunlight-dappled forest and past the occasional weathered sign. But then the GPS recalculated, sending us down a narrow, rutted path that seemed to snake deeper into the trees. I assumed it was just a back road, maybe a shortcut the locals used, but after several miles, the road turned into a mess of intersecting logging tracks, none of them marked. The deeper we went, the more I felt that quiet creeping into my bones, the one that tells you something about this isn't right. We came to a sloped slick with loose dirt, and before I could react, the tires spun, caught for a moment, then sank into a deep rut. The engine strained, but the car refused to move forward or back. I tried my phone, thinking maybe I could call for help, but the signal was gone. No bars, no data, nothing but the mocking no service icon staring back at me. Sterling's voice was small when he asked if we were stuck, and I forced a smile I didn't feel, telling him it was just temporary. I stepped out into the thick, resin-scented air, scanning the road in both directions. There was no sign of another vehicle, no sound of an engine, not even the distant echo of human activity. The only thing I heard was the faint creak of the trees and the slow drip of water from somewhere unseen. I knew enough to realize that wandering too far from the vehicle could make things worse, but we had almost no supplies, just a couple bottles of water, a few snacks, and the clothes on our backs. The July sun was still high, but out here the shadows came early, stretching long and cool across the forest floor. I remembered something I'd read once about leaving visible markers if you were lost, and that's when the idea came. Sterling helped me gather rocks from the side of the road while I pulled out the small notepad I kept in my glove compartment. In big block letters I wrote "Help" on the first sheet, then tore it out and anchored it between stones right in the middle of the road. We repeated the process, wedging notes into the bark of trees at each curve, creating a breadcrumb trail of desperation for anyone who might come by. As the hours wore on, the forest seemed to change. At first it had been merely quiet, but now it felt watchful. as if something just beyond sight was tracking us. Every snap of a twig made Sterling's head jerk around. The temperature dropped with the fading light, and the air carried a damp chill that settled into our clothes. We retreated into the car for warmth, wrapping ourselves in whatever jackets we could find, and tried to sleep, though every rustle outside made that impossible. At one point I could have sworn I heard faint footsteps passing by, too light to belong to an animal but too slow to be casual. I didn't dare open the door. By morning the water was almost gone. Sterling was pale, his usual energy drained, but he still asked if we should keep placing more notes. We did, pushing deeper down the road in one direction, careful to mark the way back. I lost track of how many times I looked over my shoulder, convinced that something was moving when I turned. The sun climbed high again, and with it came a wave of exhaustion and the dry ache of thirst. Just when my legs felt ready to give out, a distant shout cut through the stillness. For a second I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, closer this time. We called back, our voices hoarse but urgent, and moments later, two figures in bright vests emerged from between the trees. They were search and rescue volunteers drawn in by the trail of help messages we'd left. They told us they'd been combing the area since early morning, fanning out from the last location my phone had pinned before losing service. Without those notes, they admitted, they might have missed us entirely in the maze of logging roads. Relief hit me so hard I felt weak, the adrenaline draining from my body in a rush. Even now, safe at home, I think about those hours in the forest, about how easy it was to go from confident to utterly lost, from in control to entirely at the mercy of something vast and indifferent. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder about the footsteps I heard in the dark, too soft, too deliberate to belong to any of the volunteers. I tell myself it was my imagination, just the forest shifting around us. But part of me knows that in those 24 hours, we weren't entirely alone out there, and whatever else might have been watching, it decided to let us leave.